Good afternoon, everyone. We are gathered here tonight and this afternoon in the aftermath of a very special weekend. In 2011, Ehud Barak, then Israel's defense minister, warned that Israel would face a diplomatic political tsunami of international isolation and censure if it could not resolve the conflict with the Palestinians. More than a decade later, that wave held off, but is the current moving swiftly in that direction? Norway, together with Ireland and Spain, has now recognized the Palestinian state. The decision... The decision by Karim Khan, the prosecutor of the International Criminal Court, ICC, to seek arrest warrants for leaders of both Israel and Hamas was quickly followed by an International Court of Justice ruling that Israel must halt any military offensive in Rafah that could harm civilians. And on Friday, President Joe Biden, in his speech, said it's time for this war to end. As he laid out Israeli ceasefire proposal, it's perhaps the furthest Biden has gone in telling Israel that the time has arrived to stop the fighting as part of a hostage deal. My name is Hilde Sandvik, and I have with me here a very distinguished panel, and we are here to ask the very big question, Gaza, what's next? And I honestly cannot think about a more crucial moment of doing so. Because with me on stage here is Foreign Minister Espen Barth Eide. I have the Palestinian ambassador to Norway and Iceland, who has served as an ambassador for years in all the Nordics and in Hungary and here, and also, I mean, she grew up in a refugee camp in Lebanon. And here is the political entrepreneur, long-time fighter for peace between Israel and Palestine, Mr. Gershon Baskin. And on Zoom, not least, Mustafa Barghouti, who serves as General Secretary of Palestinian National Initiative. With a long, long history, and we're gonna learn to know the people on stage, but not least diving into the very big dilemmas that we're facing right now, but also the opportunities. And Espen Barth Eide, I of course want to ask you first and foremost, why now?
Exactly. Well, we recognize Palestine because it's the right thing to do, but that's old news. We have known that for decades, literally, that one day we would do it. So the question is, as you say, why now? And it might seem paradoxical that in the midst of war, why don't you focus all your efforts on just stopping the war and then see what happens? But we have over time been thinking that there is a moment in history where issuing that recognition, which is a one-time event, you recognize another state one time. It could be a support, an encouragement to a process. And then which process? Well, this is not exactly about the ceasefire work. That's incredible, and actually the answer, what happens next, should be ceasefire. But this is on the broader track of building a credible solution where Israelis and Palestinians can live peacefully together in a Palestinian state, in Israel, based on a two-state solution. And in this paradoxical world, after all the horrors we're seeing, the horrible terror attack on the 7th October by Hamas in Israel, the massive response, in my view, very much overstepping the norms of warfare, and of course all the trouble in the West Bank with growing settlements and settler violence with Palestinians. In that situation, we're also seeing a re-emergence of the understanding that there is no other long-term lasting alternative to a two-state solution. So the two-state solution, which many countries subscribe to on lip service level, now including regional neighbors who, when you asked them, said, yes, of course, two-state solution, but we didn't see them do much. Sometimes Norway and the EU and in good times America did more for a two-state solution than some of the Arab neighbors, even if they were in favor. Now we're seeing a recognition in the entire Arab world, in the whole global south, but also in the US, in the EU, obviously Norway, that there is no real alternative. We have to reignite the hope that there is a moderate path to peace, because this circle of violence is only strengthening the extremists, strengthening the people who think there is a violent solution to everything, and then violence on the other side confirms that we need more violence on our side. So in a sense, the violence of Hamas becomes an argument for a more violent Israeli response, which then again becomes an argument for more violence the other way around, and we need to get out of that. So we found that we were approaching the time for a new way of thinking of this. And it has to be said, there was a group of Arab and OIC ministers that they were given a kind of a mandate from last year's autumn. There was a joint Arab League and Islamic Cooperation meeting to look for how you could re-establish the idea of a regional peace, which means recognition of a Palestinian state, but also the normalization of relations between Saudi Arabia and other Arab states with Israel, strengthening the Palestine Authority, demobilization of unarmed non-state groups, and put all this into a package. And they were here in December, and I thought this is an interesting approach. Yeah. Maybe it's not one thing that will solve the problem, but a series of pieces of a big puzzle. And working with them, we started to take a role as the European support group in the sense of that Arab initiative, and we established a contact group between concerned European countries and this group of Arab countries. PLO was part of all this. Always keeping other people informed, including the Americans, but they are not part of it, but they're interested in this. And out of that came the strong advice to us from our Arab friends that one of the cards you hold is this recognition, and maybe it's time to play it. And we considered carefully, we consulted with others, and we found out that Spain, Ireland, and Norway were ready to do it at the same time. And now Slovenia is joining the club, and more countries are coming. And let me just, before I end, just talk about the timing here. We announced on the 22nd of May, but with effect from the 28th. Why 28th? Yeah. Because on the 26th, which was last Sunday, and the 27th, we had a series of meetings, one with the new Prime Minister of Palestine, Mustafa, with the donors, which was a very successful donor meeting because the situation of the Palestine Authority is very dire. They need much more help right now, which is paramount for all Palestinians, but actually also for Israel, because the last thing Israel wants would be a collapse also on the West Bank. And then we had this contact group meeting. Then the Arab group met with the EU Foreign Affairs Council, and the day after was the day of our recognition. And I felt it was the right thing to do. And after having done it, I'm even more convinced that it was the right moment of doing it.
Because criticism has been there, and we're not diving into that. But just if you can answer shortly to this, when then Joe Biden on Friday came up with this, Sabbath has already started, and he came with his speech. How do you see, because Norway and US have been partners, bed partners almost, in these issues, and that's one of the reasons why Norway could host the Oslo process back in the days. But was this coordinated with the Americans?
They were well informed. We make our own decisions, but we wanted them to be aware. So they saw this coming, and we informed them that it was coming now. But we have, in our relationship to the US, we understood decades ago that sometimes there are things you can do as a superpower, But there are also things you cannot do as a superpower, particularly if you're the US. And then there are things you cannot do as a small power, but there are things you can do as a small power. So that's a constructive, symbiotic relationship. We do not need to move in close step on every single issue, but the long-term direction is we, like the US, support the two-state solution, and we believe that it should be governed by the Palestine Authority, and we need to strengthen the Palestine Authority, and this is the long-term goal. Yeah. You said short, so yeah.
Marie Antoinette Sedin, as the ambassador to Norway, you celebrated this recognition. But does it have anything to say? Is it more than a symbol?
Yes, it is. First of all, I want to express our gratitude, our thanks. It was really appreciated by all the Palestinians in Norway and even in Palestine and in the diaspora. We couldn't celebrate, actually. It's a big time, it's historical time, historical day, but because of the massacres committed in Gaza and our people in Gaza who are suffering and dying of starvation, of bombing, we cannot celebrate. I mean, there is a pain and sad feeling inside us. And this feeling is a mixture of happiness, sadness, frustration, eager. So we have to define that. We have to do something that we as a nation can celebrate our happy moments. And this decision, it's a big step. It's a brave step of the Norwegian government. It gives us more hope to look to the future. And it's a kind of commitment. It's a proof of commitment that we deserve our self-determination, our freedom, our dignity, and independence. So that's why it means a lot to us. It doesn't end the conflict, but it's a step forward towards bringing in more players on the international arena to recognize Palestine and put Palestine as a state, as a full member of the United Nations, and then we go to negotiation. But just before everything, we have to stop the war. We have to end these crimes and atrocities, all this displacement. And even get in aid, because we starved a lot. We starved in 48, we starved in 67, we starved in all the wars on Gaza before October last year. So our life was always been under massacres and under the bombardment. So this has to be stopped, first of all, and then we go back. Then we continue to implement two-state solution, to go back to negotiation, and to give my people a hope to live in peace and dignity.
And how do you then see Mr. Biden's speech?
Well, we know very well, and especially we, the Palestinians, it's not Mr. Biden or Mr. Obama or Clinton or Trump who made this decision. It's a global decision by the Congress. It's not the administration of Mr. Biden. And as we know, the American interest in the area and in supporting Israel for its self-defense, as they call it, or for its existence, we cannot see any difference, and we cannot expect any difference if the policy of the Congress in the United States can't be changed, has to be changed. And now we can see that not only in Europe, not only in Norway, we have a lot of demonstrations from the civil society, everybody asking to stop the war. And now in America, the new generations, the brainwashed generation, they are striking, supporting ending the war and the two-state solution and the freedom for Palestine.
I want to move over to you, Gershon Baskin, because when I talked with you this weekend, you said the next 24 hours will be very crucial. At that point, it was still Sabbath. And we know that there were a couple of administration of Netanyahu who could not come to the fore and say what they wanted to say, or now we know what they've said. Israelis afterwards protested in the street, 100,000. But you have been into these conversations for so long time, and you've been in all, the intifadas, you have talked to Hamas as well. What now?
What now is we're waiting to see whether or not Israel and Hamas will agree to what Biden presented as an Israeli agreement. And as I said to you on the phone, it seems to me that Biden took a skeleton that was handed to him by Netanyahu and added a lot of meat to the bones that may have not been in the Israeli proposal. Nonetheless, he sandaled the Netanyahu government into this plan right now, and Netanyahu is facing the reality that it seems that a majority of people in his government are not supporting it. Hamas has said yes, conditionally. There's no definitive answer from Hamas yet. Hamas should say yes, and they should lock Israel into a position where the people will take to the streets because this war has to end. The war has to end. There needs to be a long-term, sustainable ceasefire. The Israeli hostages need to be brought home. And we need to figure out a way that there will be a viable, sustainable Palestinian governance taking over Gaza, leading to stability and reconstruction, eventually new elections, because the Palestinian people have to have the right to choose their leaders. We have a Palestinian Authority, with all due respect to Mahmoud Abbas, who I know personally have spent many hours with, is in the 18th year of a 4-year term. And if there's one thing that I think every Palestinian agrees to, is the right to have elections and to elect a new government. We in Israel have to get rid of our leaders, because our leaders are serving their own self-political interest and not serving the interest of the state of Israel. The most surprising thing that's happened from this war, as the foreign minister said, is that the two-state solution is back on the table. I thought it was dead.
And that was dead, actually. It was totally dead, and it's been mocked as well for
I've been spending the last years talking to Israelis and Palestinians, finding alternatives to the two-state solution, and here it is back in front of us. And I agree with the ambassador that the most important thing to happen now is getting the state of Palestine recognized and full membership in the United Nations. There are 193 member states of the United Nations. Today, I think, if I'm correct, there are 142 countries that recognize the state of Palestine. 46
now.
There are 165 countries that recognize the state of Israel. If we are going to make the two-state solution real for Israelis and Palestinians, we need the whole world to recognize the right of self-determination of the Jewish people and the Palestinian people. Let's not forget that between the river and the sea that everyone talks about, there are 7 million Israeli Jews and 7 million Palestinians, and no one is going anywhere.
And the river to the sea is now kind of coming from both sides. And I just want to, before I go to Mr. Mustafa Barghouti, and I just want to ask you a little bit into what is actually happening in Israel, because the political movement in Israel the last 20 years, even before, since, I don't know, I don't want to put names in here, but it's really, it is moving into a fascist direction. And you have in your government people who clearly define themselves as fascist as well. And you can also see the religious majority coming in with a much stronger force. So it seems as if also Israel is, it has been turning away from the democratic aim that was there at some point.
We are a very divided society, and Netanyahu has politicized everything. The issue of the Israeli hostages, which should cut across all sectors of Israeli society, we should all be campaigning to bring the hostages home, is politicized. Everything is politicized. And it's more or less, as was in 5 rounds of Israeli elections, the only issue discussed was Netanyahu yes or Netanyahu no. Netanyahu was the longest-serving prime minister in the history of Israel. has managed to convince Israeli society and most of the world that Israel can occupy another people for 57 years and expect to live in peace. That blew up in our face on October 7th. Now, it's very difficult to judge public opinion today, both in Israel and in Palestine. We have two traumatized societies. Israelis experience the greatest trauma since the Holocaust. And we have not moved to post-trauma. We are living the trauma every day. Palestinians are living through the Nakba. There's no question about it. This is perhaps even worse than the Nakba of 1948, what Palestinians are living. And it's not only in Gaza. Every Palestinian everywhere in the world is experiencing this feeling of catastrophe. So when we look at public opinion, it's very difficult to judge because we're responding very emotionally. But I think the trends are very clear that Israel, my part of Israel, is fighting for our lives. We're fighting to protect our liberal democracy and a democracy that wants to live in peace with our Palestinian neighbors.
And that is a very good cue, I would say, to invite Mustafa Barghouti in this conversation. And I'm looking at you, so I know when you raise your hand, I will see you, and it's more important. And you've been sitting here quietly and patiently listening, and with all your experience and what you see now. First, you see it as a diplomatic tsunami hitting Israel now, that times are changing and policies are changing and sentiments seem to be changing. What do you see?
Well, thank you for hosting me. And I'm glad to be with this wonderful panel. And I want to say to Minister Espen and to Norway also one more time on behalf of our people, the Palestinian people, thank you for recognizing Palestine. Because the recognition is not just about recognizing the right of a state, it's about confirming the right of self-determination for Palestinian people. It's also about Israel, that all the illegal facts on the ground that they have created, including settlements, will not have an impact in the long run and will not deter the rights of the Palestinian people to be free and independent and to live in dignity and peace. In response to your question, I've lived through so many times and long times to understand that even when we have good moments and when we have a good opportunity, unless something is done, it could vanish and it could fade away. And the very good example of that is the 31 years that have passed since Oslo Agreement was signed, and how the Israeli establishment was allowed actually to destroy that process and destroy Oslo Agreement in total. And that's why I think now, if we want to speak about what is needed most, of course, the first thing is to stop this terrible atrocity, this terrible war. To stop the 3 war crimes Israel is committing now in Gaza in parallel. The war crime of genocide, the war crime of collective punishment, and the war crime of ethnic cleansing. 2.3 million people are going to hell. We have lost up till this moment 5.5% of the population of Gaza who have been injured or killed. More than 15,000 children killed. More than 46,000 people killed, mostly civilians, if we count the 10,000 people under the rubble who are decomposing now. It's a terrible situation, and this has to stop because the war is going on and the attacks are continuous. So the first goal has to be immediate stop of this war. And yes, there is an unprecedented amount of solidarity with Palestinians everywhere in the world. Yes, there is a very big pressure on Israel to stop this war now, and this has to be utilized immediately. But the second goal should be, after stopping the war, is to bring back the people to their areas, to the places they were displaced from, especially in the north. And then the question will be how to rehabilitate Gaza. And of course, the first thing that needs to be immediately rehabilitated are things that relate to the ability of people to live, to have clean water, to have electricity. And most important, to rehabilitate the medical structures, the hospitals that Israel destroyed, the educational facility. But to get to that, I want to clarify that what we need here is a new Palestinian government, a national consensus government that is accepted by everybody so that it can really work in both West Bank and Gaza, and that can work to not to allow Israel to keep its occupation of Gaza. What we need is an interim government that should prepare for elections. True. We haven't had democratic elections since 2000. And it's the right of the Palestinian people to elect their leaders democratically and freely. And let me tell you, had we have elections in 2021, we would not have had this war.
That's what you say, yeah.
Unfortunately, these elections did not take place. And had we have the elections, no single party in Palestine would have gotten an absolute majority, which would mean, and that is the case today, which would mean we have to learn how to have a pluralistic democratic system with unity based on democratic participation. And let me say also that if we want to see a solution and move into the next stage, which is a political process, to end occupation, to end the system of apartheid, and to end and remove all the illegal settlements, we need a unified Palestinian leadership.
But
that is including all Palestinian political parties in the PLO as representative of the Palestinian people.
The two-state solution, as we're actually talking about here now, that means, I mean, where do you see the West Bank in that picture? There are 700,000 Israelis living there now. How is it even possible to conceptualize a two-state solution in that environment?
As Mr. Baskin said rightly, we have more than 7 million Palestinians living on the land of historic Palestine and about 7 million Jewish people. The only two solutions is either a two-state solution or one democratic state with everybody living in democracy and equality. And yes, we can't have a two-state solution if Israel doesn't remove its settlers from the West completely. If Israel does not end the illegal annexation of East Jerusalem. If Israel doesn't do that, there will be no two Palestinians, no two-state solution. So the question is to Israel, what do they want? The majority of the Israelis, unfortunately, at this very moment, unfortunately, I've just read a poll that shows that 60% of the Israelis want a deal with Hamas to bring back the Israeli prisoners, but 80% want to continue the war. And unfortunately, while there is a majority in Palestine that would accept two-state solution, there isn't such a majority in Israel. And the question here is, if Israel refuses the two-state solution and refuses the one-state solution, then what is the solution? Mr. Smotrich and Netanyahu have declared it very clearly. Smotrich, who called himself a fascist homophobe, and said that Israel must fill the West Bank with settlements and settlers so that Palestinians would lose any hope of a state of their own, and then have to choose between leaving, which is ethnic cleansing, or accepting a life of subjugation, which is apartheid, or die, as he said, which is exactly the genocide that Israel is committing now in Gaza. In my opinion, when they refuse two states and refuse one state, they mean that they only want ethnic cleansing. We, the Palestinians, will not allow them to do so. We are here and we will not leave anywhere.
But this is exactly now we're deep into the pudding where it starts getting complicated. But still, the two-state solution is back on the table. And with all respect, do you see any possibilities? Now, Norway is also accused of getting a new friend in Saudi, which is also an unlikely couple in this. Is it, I mean, peace forces on ground? Is it US that's going to go in and secure? How do you see it? And what about the 700,000 on the West Bank or in the settlements?
Well, first, when we recognize Palestine, we obviously define what we recognize, and it is based on 67 borders. So that's Gaza, West Bank, and then Jerusalem as divided capital, which is also what was seen and envisaged in the Oslo Agreement. Then there's some space for land swaps. If the two governments later want to do some exchange of lands, you can solve some of this, of course, or there might be even Israelis who will prefer to live in Palestine, but then will have to live, of course, on the terms of that new state, and somebody would have to be withdrawn. That's part, I mean, yes, part of the problem in the West Bank is the expansion of settlements. All illegal under international law, interestingly, some of them illegal under Israeli law. So this Netanyahu government, by the way, we typically say Israel. I think that's unfair to all the good Israelis. It's the Netanyahu government we're talking about. And the Netanyahu government has accepted de facto the establishment of settlements that are illegal in Israel, not only in the world, but they all are. So occupation has to end, and you need to have, meaningful connected land. So also all these roads that are settlers only will have to go or be converted. But these things can be solved if there's political will. You've even had a history of Israeli, even right-wing leaders actually forcing Israeli settlements out of Gaza. So historically, these things have happened. It's one of the problems, but it's not the problem. The problem is to get to a full understanding that there is no alternative to the two-state solution. And as Mr. Barghouti so correctly says, either you have two states or you have one state. And I have emotional, intellectual sympathy with the idea of a pluricultural one-state solution. I think we were many people who were thinking of that when the two-state solution looked as in dead water. But of course, that the Israelis will then have to accept that the Jewish character of the state will be challenged by a majority will be not Jewish. And are they ready to do that? And after all this violence, I think it's simply not possible any longer, even if it's a beautiful idea. I think the only thing that can actually happen is a two-state solution, and which requires a Palestinian state. And the recognition is just one part of several efforts to lift the Palestinian side as we move into sort of the final process of defining that state.
But we're into a very complicated political landscape here, because, I mean, this is a war. I cannot remember in my lifetime that we've had a war that affects internal politics in all over the world, and it affects elections. And until now, we haven't mentioned Hamas. And Baskin, I want to ask you, because you have communicated with several Hamas leaders for decades, and you also did it from 7th of October, and then you had a brief stop. But as I understand, you have restarted that kind of personal channel, if you may. And Israel will say, we won't accept anything as long as Hamas is there. And now we all see, I mean, is it even possible to erase Hamas? But how do you see Hamas in this, how could I say, this puzzle, which seems to be, someone wrote a cube with 4 black sides to it.
Our challenge is to make Hamas a Palestinian problem and not an Israeli problem. At the end of the day, as Dr. Mustafa said, the Palestinians need to have a unified national government which will govern the West Bank and Gaza, eventually East Jerusalem as their capital. And within the Palestinian state, there cannot be an armed militia. The model cannot be Lebanon, where you have an ineffective government and an armed military that controls the country. The Palestinian state needs to control the use of force, and it cannot tolerate an armed group within the state. There is no military solution for dealing with Hamas. The longer Israel stays in Gaza, the more I guarantee there will be armed insurgency against the Israeli occupation of Gaza, and Israeli soldiers will keep coming home dead. There is no military solution to this conflict. There are only political solutions, both to the issue of Hamas and Gaza and the issue of peace between Israel and Palestine. And therefore, I urge everyone to think about how we can empower Palestinians to confront Hamas. They need to confront Hamas. They need to figure out how to disarm them, how to integrate a legitimate Islamic political party into Palestinian political culture and life, and not an armed militia that threatens us all.
This is incredibly important, and I just want to underline that with statehood comes rights and obligations. The rights are rather obvious, but of course, then once a state is recognized in place, it also has obligation towards other states, or for instance, preventing terror activity coming from its own ground. So it will be a formal obligation, but also, I'm sure, something the Palestinian state would want to do in order to continue that, good development. And it's incredibly important to say that what we did was very much also an anti-Hamas move. It was very much to say which the Palestinian state that we recognize exists in a sense as the state of Palestine, that's a member of the UN and is run by the Palestinian Authority. It's not run by Hamas, it's run by the Palestinian Authority. Yes, we need to expand that government. It has to represent all Palestinians. It's absolutely in agreement, but it has to be based on what led to the Oslo Agreement, where one of the things the PLO did, which includes Fatah and several other movements, is to say we renounce violence. From now on, we will continue to work towards a Palestinian state with non-violent means, and they kept to that promise, which is why there is no terror activity stemming from the West Bank into Israel, and Israel should be happy about that. You wouldn't want that on the other side in addition to Gaza. So it's, bottom line, it's in the interest of Israel too that this Palestinian state is established, and it should be established now. And if you allow the Palestinian Authority to collapse first and then try to rebuild it, it's going to be much harder.
Barghouti, yes, Sedin? Yeah.
Yes, I just want to add something also about this conflict. I mean, Hamas didn't exist all 76 years. And before that, we had the same problem. The conflict didn't start recently. The conflict has been living with us since even before I was born. So this conflict is not who is leading. The people, the nation, the Palestinians have the right to elect their own government. It doesn't matter whom and which and where. But this is not to justify that there is no peaceful solution because of Hamas or other factions. It has to do with the rights of the Palestinian people to self-determination. And then let the Palestinian people choose who will lead them. So Hamas wasn't there all these 76 years. So Israel behaved the same. Many massacres before and many massacres after. So they cannot be justified. Because of Hamas, they can destroy and kill so many thousands of Palestinians because they are defending themselves. Who will defend himself? Israel, the occupier, the one who attacks, or the people living under oppression and occupation?
And Barghouti, I also want you to, you heard the challenge from both Eide and Baskin. And what's your response? You have been very critical towards Fatah, for instance, and you've been very critical towards the government in Palestine, as such. But what do you say about Hamas' role in this now?
Well, I totally agree with what the Palestinian ambassador just said. Before, you have to remember that Fatah, before Hamas, was accused of being a terrorist organization. And because it was using military struggle against occupation, which is by international law illegal. International law says that people who are under military occupation have the right to resist occupation in all forms, including military forms, as long as they respect international humanitarian law, which means not attacking women, not attacking children, etc. But the principle of military resistance is an acceptable principle for international law. Now, Hamas has never been more ready as it is now, and I know them very well, very well. They've never been so ready to accept a Palestinian state. And they don't want to keep a militia if there is a freedom, if there is a Palestinian independent state, if there is no occupation. Why would they keep a militia? They wouldn't. And militia, there was no militia before when Oslo Agreement was signed. But what led to this situation? The military Palestinian resistance is a result, not a cause. The cause is occupation. The cause is injustice. The cause is oppression. The cause is the fact that we have no safety ourselves. And the world has to be fair, especially the West. You can't say, you can't use different parameters for Israelis and other parameters for Palestinians. We are the ones who should feel very unsafe, given that Israel is a very large nuclear power, given that Israel has the most powerful army in the Middle East, given the fact that Israel is the one that is killing us around the clock. And what I say, you know me, you know how much I support nonviolent resistance and how, in principle, I support nonviolence. But I'm telling you, the question here is not because Hamas has military branch that there is a problem. No, the problem is occupation. Once occupation is over, once we have a democratic Palestinian state and we have elections, of course there will be unified Palestinian police, there will be unified Palestinian defense structure. That's what Hamas agreed about in our unity agreements before in Cairo and in other places. So the question here now is how to end occupation and allow Palestinians to have a state of their own. It's not vice versa. It's not that the problem are the Palestinians. And Hamas is part of the Palestinian structure. They will go to elections like everybody else. And the people will choose. As the ambassador, I very much like what the ambassador said. It's the Palestinian people who have the right to choose their leaders freely and democratically.
Baskin.
Yeah, please allow me to perhaps add some argument here. It's not a question, occupation yes or occupation no. The occupation has to end. It's illegal and it's against the interest of Israel. And it's not a question of whether or not the armed struggle is legal by international law. I think if we're looking forward, it's not a question of being right. It's a question of being smart. And I think if there's one clear lesson from everything that's happened since October 7th, is that there is no viable armed struggle for Palestine. Too many people have been killed, too much destruction has happened. I would expect for people like Dr. Mustafa, who I know supports nonviolent and has led nonviolent movements in Palestine, to say that we as Palestinians are finished with the armed struggle. We reject it. No political party will be allowed to run for elections in Palestine who support an armed struggle, because you have to protect yourselves. Hamas is responsible. Before Israel, Hamas is responsible for the death and destruction that's been brought to Gaza, and the Palestinian people need to put them on trial. Of course, Israel committed the war crimes in Gaza. Excuse me, Mustafa, one moment, let me finish. Israel has committed war crimes.
We can't hear any of you, so just
Israel has committed war crimes in Gaza, and the amount of death and destruction has crossed every moral red line that exists in humanity.
From Israel?
From Israel. The same as Hamas crossed all the moral red lines on October 7th. There is no armed struggle anymore which will help the Palestinian people. They need to say no more armed struggle. We will only fight Israel diplomatically. We will end the occupation with the support of the entire world, because we will capture the higher moral ground. The occupation is immoral. We Palestinians will be moral, and we will show our morality.
But, excuse me,
Can I say something?
we did that for 30 years. In Oslo, we did that. After Oslo, we did that. We waited 30 years to get out something from the Israeli government. Not
The violence
a single
never
government.
ended.
Wait a minute. I give you time, so please listen to me. It's not like that we have to avoid resistance. It's you that you are occupying us.
I agree.
It's you who are confiscating our land,
Right.
uprooting our trees, and demolishing our homes. And my people, half of them in the West Bank and in East Jerusalem and in Gaza are homeless. How can you explain that? How can we say, okay, Israel, please come take everything what you want.
Don't say
we
that.
won't resist.
Don't say that. Resist. But no more armed struggle.
Can I say?
Why? Why are you using all kind of weapons?
It's not a
and we are
question
not?
of being. It's not a question of being right. It's now a question of being smart. And the question is, does Palestine
We
have a
did
strategy?
that in 30 years.
No, you didn't. I'm
and
sorry.
we get nothing.
Can I bring in Barghouti here as well? Now, yeah, please.
Can I speak, please?
Yes.
Okay. Well, let me explain something. As Mr. Baskin said, I led myself a lot of anti-occupation struggle in a peaceful manner and in a non-violent manner. I was injured 7 times during these demonstrations, including once shot twice with live ammunitions while I was trying to treat an injured person. Nevertheless, I never lost hope in non-violent resistance. I spoke to Hamas a lot about this. And let me remind you that Hamas accepted our approach from 2014, after the war, till 2019, they committed completely to non-violent resistance. Did the world take notice of that? Did anybody care about what was happening in Palestine? Did anybody say to Israel, we will impose sanctions on you if you continue to build settlements? No. And I'm saying the solution is not violence. But when you say there should be no military actions from the side of Palestinians, you should also say there should be no military actions from the side of Israel.
Of course.
He says that.
Which is the occupying power.
I don't have a double standard.
No, let me finish. And we need international protection. Give us protection from the Israeli army. Give us protection now, not only from the Israeli army, but from the illegal settlers who are led by Israeli ministers like Smotrich and Ben-Gvir, and who are wandering around now in the West Bank with terrorist groups, burning houses, burning farms, burning cars, and killing people. Who will protect us? We need immediate international protection. Provide us with immediate international protection, and we will not need any military action. But the most important issue here is that any rule that will be applied to Palestinians has to be applied to Israel as well. Discriminate.
And I can also quote you, Baskin, because August last year, it's before October, you actually wrote a op-ed where you said Israel is responsible for Palestinian killings. That was your main argument in that article. But Espen Barth Eide, lots of things, of course, to go into here, and you had your hand up. I also have a question, but you could start first.
Well, first, I think Mr. Baskin is probably one of the Israelis that has most clearly been criticizing Israel's violence. So let's recognize that, and I think it is a point that we should try to avoid double standards, and that goes in all directions. So that's not a one-way street. I think what I do think this conversation illustrates is how urgently needed it is that we recognize that there are still people, actually on both sides, who would like a different outcome. And that these are the people we need to help, because this circle of violence will not, more and more violence. And of course, since Israel has the strongest army, there will be more dead people when the Israelis fight back, when the attacks comes. And let's get out of that, let's get back to the whole idea. But with the new impulse, which we are seeing now, and with the recognition that we do with other countries, more countries are coming with a very active support for building, transforming, modernizing, upgrading the Palestinian Authority so that you have the embryo of a state when the state is actually physically there on the ground, deal with all these issues. And let's recognize that there were many Palestinians who have abstained from violence, even if they were exposed to violence. And these are the people we really want now to see and work with and recognize, and so that this can be a credible solution for all people. And again, I say, we do this as a very close friend of Palestine, but also as a genuine friend of Israel. We honestly believe that the best way is a two-state solution, and we need to get there now. We cannot just go back to 6th of October. It's not like the day before the terror attacks where, was a normal times. That was a highly unstable situation, which is why, and here's my point, we need to work on a ceasefire now. Right. We need to work on humanitarian aid, massive increase now. But we also need to think now about the long-term outcome, because we need to capture the moment and use this terrible human drama also to drive us forward and not backwards to another situation where you wait for 2 years and the whole thing begins again.
And you mentioned, and several of you have mentioned, this concept of double moral standards and talking with two tongues and US in this, and that is, I mean, the anger. I accidentally I watched. I went into X, formerly known as Twitter, and saw former President Obama post about Biden's speech. And reading under, it was kind of discouraging, because the immediate response, it was nothing there like, well done, now we can start working. It's like scolding, very, very hard. And this feelings, emotions around talking with, having a double standard, that is now thrown at the West in particular, from all kinds of parts of the world. How do you relate to that, Barth Eide?
I mean, it's bordering on a catastrophe for the trust in international norms and institutions. And the fact that many Western countries, I would say not us, and there are exceptions, but too many Western countries have treated Israel's behavior in the Gaza war with too much tolerance, which then opens this whole debate about double standards. And I think it's fair; it's a legitimate critique. And the problem out of there are two ways. Either, as Russia and others hope, we will basically say there are no norms. There are no norms anywhere. So forget about Ukraine, because people don't take these things seriously. You just pick from a menu. Or you actually re-establish that there is one set of standards, that international humanitarian law applies to everybody. Killing, if bombing a flat of a block of civilian flats in Gershon is wrong, it's also wrong in Gaza City, and you criticize in the same way. And if terrorism is wrong, it's also wrong if it's Hamas terrorism. That you actually apply the norms systemically. That's the only way to regain trust in international institutions. And we hear, the Secretary General of the UN and a lot of good people out there are feeling now that the whole trust in the multilateral system is breaking up, not only in the Middle East, but in the world. And that's something, Mr. Zelensky, the brave president of Ukraine, is aware that support for Ukraine, which is extremely important, is undermined globally by this sense that, he's the West favorite, so why would we support him when they don't support the Palestinian? This is really bad. And again, double standards should be criticized from both directions. We all need one set of standards, not a menu of standards to choose from.
We have a couple of minutes left. And of course, we will not be able to come up with one solution, but we have kind of managed, even though it is heated because it is so much at stake. But if we're going to answer Gaza, what's next? We haven't been talking so much about Biden's speech and the proposal, and we don't know yet how the answer to that will be. But if we will just take a short round, Gaza, what's next? Is that possible?
Shall I start?
You can start.
Well, I mean, we witnessed many wars in Gaza, and we've been building up Gaza again. We tried to fulfill our commitments to build up Gaza again and again and again, and you, the West, were paying. So why we don't change the concept? Israel has to pay for its bombardment and for this destruction. Israel has to be responsible. It's not justifying what happened 7th October for the destruction of Gaza. This is a genocidal atrocities. It's really war crimes, humanitarian crimes that no one in the world can accept it. How can we accept it? We cannot announce. We announced many times that we will have an armed resistance, but okay, in Gaza we have armed resistance. What about the West Bank? We've been without arms for many decades. What's happening in the West Bank? Just this year, from January until now, we lost over 400 people were killed by the settlers attacked and the IDF. How many olive trees were uprooted in the West Bank? The olive trees are not armed, so they are not attacking anyone. Burning the olive trees and burning the houses while peoples are living in, sleeping, like in Hawara. So what we're talking about, resistance and non-resistance, it's occupation. End the occupation and then ask us to recognize you as an independent civil state that are not committing crimes against us.
I hope that the Palestinian people don't wait for Israel to pay to rebuild Gaza, because let's be real, you're going to be waiting a very long time. And what needs to happen in Gaza is there needs to be a new Palestinian unified government, regime, temporary authority taking over Gaza, inviting the Arab neighbors who are willing to send a peacekeeping force to Gaza that will replace the Israelis who have to withdraw from Gaza. There needs to be an end to the war. There needs to be a period of stabilization and security for the people of Gaza and for their Israeli neighbors. There needs to be an international commitment to rebuild Gaza in a period of peace. We need a regional negotiation, not a bilateral Israeli-Palestinian negotiation that will never work, and not an American-led peace process again. The Americans are the worst at leading peace processes in the Middle East. Norway did a very good job in facilitating the Oslo peace process, not in mediating it. What we need today is a regional framework, a regional table, where Israel, Egypt, Jordan, Palestine, the Emirates, Bahrain, the Saudis, maybe Morocco, maybe others joining together. We saw on the night when Iran attacked Israel a regional defense alliance that was not negotiated, but it worked. And it proved that Israel's security is based in the region, not by American bombs, but by regional agreements, that Palestine and Israel are the core members of it. This is where we need to look forward. We need to see that within 2 years, 3 years, there will be Palestinian national elections and hopefully a responsible, legitimate Palestinian government for the state of Palestine will be elected that will negotiate in a regional framework with a new government in Israel for peace.
Fingers crossed, you might say. I shouldn't say this, but Mustafa Barghouti.
Well, first of all, about Biden's statement. Biden said this was an Israeli proposal. But we haven't heard from Netanyahu that he accepts his own proposal. So the problem here is that Netanyahu continues to play games. And in my opinion, unless the world tells Israel that there will be sanctions, they will not stop this war. So there has to be a very clear message to Israel that you have to stop this war and stop this atrocity. This is the beginning. Second, you know, we have 45 medical teams with the organization that I have the honor to be in with as a volunteer. 45 medical teams tell us horrible stories about so many people in need for help. so many patients who will die because there is no medical services, so many injured people, especially those that were burned recently in the Israeli bombardment, who will die because there is no single burn unit left. So there is an urgency here, and the urgency is not only to stop the war, but to quickly rebuild the structures that are needed. And let me tell you about the political. We do not need to substitute Israeli occupation with any other occupation. We, the Palestinians, have been capable of building a state. It's not a problem. We don't need to be told that we need to rebuild and restructure. Everything is there. The question is, do we have the freedom to work on it? And I think the solution to Gaza is that Israel must get out of Gaza, allow Palestinians to have an interim agreement, a government that is acceptable by all Palestinian groups, national consensus government, and it will take the responsibility of rebuilding. It will take the responsibility of maintaining the unity between West Bank and Gaza, and it should take the responsibility of preparing for elections. One last thing I want to say. The Israelis must understand, and the Jewish people in general at large must understand, that our struggle for freedom as Palestinians is not against Jewish people. It's not even against Israeli people. It's about our right to be free from the oppression. And as a matter of fact, I think that Israelis themselves will not be free as long as we, the Palestinians, are not free. There is no way they can dismiss us. There is no way they can dismiss us. And that's why when we speak about Palestinian freedom, when we say Palestine should be free, it means that everybody will be free from occupation, from apartheid, from racism, and from any form of discrimination. That's the future we should look for. And that's the future that will bring peace and prosperity for everybody.
Thank you.
And you were here now, you're invited to sum up everything.
Yeah, well, thank
even
you.
though we're 5 minutes past, but I think it's important to hear your words.
But thank you for an excellent conversation. I want, as Gershon Baskin just said, I think the regional framing is incredibly important, and I think that this is the new wine. Is maybe a bad example, given it's the Arab group. But you know, this is the new impulse. After Oslo, there were some quite credible attempts, like Camp David and Taba. But looking back, I think one of the things that were lost was the regional framework. And then came the original Arab Peace Initiative. This is now re-emerging, but at something much more serious, and I think there's much more commitment. And the reason that we linked our recognition to developments in this Arab-European contact group is very much because that is the setting in which we can embed the Palestinian state and the two-state solution much better than before. So, you know, the immediate answer, what happens next, I hope, inshallah, that there is peace, that there is an end of the war and the end of fighting. And just after that, the humanitarian rebuilding was been mentioned because that's an extreme need. But then comes Palestine. What's next is that Palestine actually is established as a genuine state, which is consistent. You know, Gaza, West Bank, shared capital of Jerusalem, as will be finally decided. But you know that this one Palestine, and that is the Palestine in which I think a lot of people want to invest. So the rebuilding, you know, to give shelter. You need it tomorrow, or you need it yesterday, actually. But to really rebuild has to happen in that context. And I think if people know what is the future, there will be a state, it will be recognized, it will work as a state in the international system. It is much more attractive for Gulf money, Western money, maybe even, you know, Israeli money.
Norwegian money too.
Well, always. We've learned that lesson. But we want some others on board as well, you know, to actually do that rebuilding into something very different, because we cannot go back. We have to go forward. And in a crisis, there's also always an opportunity in crisis, and this crisis is so deep, so we have to envisage a big opportunity, and I think it's right in front of our eyes.
Thank you so much for joining in and leaning into this conversation. I want to add that having sit like this and talk, that is, I mean, from my perspective, the hope that we can have, that we don't stop talking to each other. So thank you so much for all joining in, and thanks to the audience. Thank you.
Thank you. I enjoyed that.